The famous author Virginia Woolf once said that language is wine upon the lips. Now, when she said wine, I think she meant the intoxicating beverage and not like complaining. If we could see that quote in print, then that would clear up any ambiguity. But this actually highlights some of the differences between writing and speaking, and that's one of the main points that I want to make in this video lecture on Chapter 10, Using Words Well. The first point I want to make is the difference between writing and speaking. Secondly, I want to give you a couple of techniques for the use of language that help you meet your public speaking goals. And third, we're going to talk about, I want to give you a concrete call to action to tie all the stuff together that we're going to talk about today. So first, really briefly, the difference between writing and speaking. This is important because some of you are recycling some topics you've used in the past semesters, and because you're interested in these topics, you've written papers on them before. And if you are going to try to retrofit a paper into an outline, you will run into some problems because papers and public speaking outlines are fundamentally different in some important ways. One of the most important ways that they're different has to do with the use of repetition. When we are writing things, we are encouraged not to use repetition. All you have to do is type it once, and then it's on the page, and then it's the reader's responsibility to absorb that message. If the person who is reading your paper zones out, or they didn't quite catch it the first time, they can stop reading, go back up to the top of the paragraph, and read it again. And so the responsibility is on the reader. However, when you are giving a public speech, the reader does not have the help of having a piece of paper. Therefore, all of the responsibility is then on the speaker to make sure that the message gets across. Of course, the audience has to listen, but the audience needs all the help they can get, and so we're encouraged to be much more repetitive. We tell them what we're going to tell them in the introduction, then we tell them again in the body in great detail, sometimes using repetition in the body, and then we tell them again in the conclusion, because we know that if the audience member zones out, or they didn't hear you the first time, or they didn't understand, they're going to need to hear that. They're going to need to hear that again. So that's one big difference between writing and speaking. But furthermore, when we're speaking, we can be a lot more colloquial, and we can be a lot more conversational than we can be when we're writing. When we are speaking, of course, we still have to be proper, use good grammar and good dialect and all of that. But we don't have to maybe nitpick quite as much about word order and things like that as we would if we were writing a formal paper in an English class or something. So all of those things are just some differences to be aware of when you are thinking about speeches in the real world, and when you're writing your speech outlines, you make sure to be aware of those differences. Don't create your speech exactly the way you would create a paper. Okay. Secondly, I wanted to talk about some goals that public speakers have, and then some techniques, some language techniques that will help you meet those goals. The two goals I want to talk about are communicating effectively and communicating memorably. Now, the first goal, communicating effectively, I think tends to come pretty naturally to many people, because we've been practicing communicating effectively all our life. The techniques that the book offers for communicating effectively that has to do with language, they talk about using unbiased language or gender-neutral language, trying to be inclusive or universal. They talk about using simple words and concrete words rather than unnecessarily using overly complicated words or jargon. And they talk about you don't want to overuse your pet phrases or unlike figures of speech that you really like as a speaker, distinctive to you. If you overuse those, they start to become distracting. But things like that often, come pretty easily to people once they learn them. Not a big deal. But the second goal, communicating it in a way that is memorable, I think it does not come as naturally to most people. It doesn't come as naturally to me in any event. But we want to communicate memorably. We want to write our speech and deliver our speech in a way that's going to be interesting. We want to give it a little bit of crackle. We want our speech to pop. And so the book gives some examples of some techniques to use. And if you're English majors, which I know some of you are, you're going to be really familiar with these. The book talks about things like metaphors, things like similes, figures of speech, These are things that I tend not to spend a whole lot of time on in class because I'm aware of the fact that we all learn them at earlier points in our schooling. But the point is you don't want to just learn them for the sake of learning them. It's important to use them, and this is exactly what they're for. When you're writing either a paper or a speech, I can't really speak to their use in papers, but I do know they are important in speeches. If you want to hold your audience's attention, create a compelling work, then these things have to be in there. We tend to leave them out. I mean, when you're writing an outline, when you're putting together a speech, you have all these other things in mind. You're trying to communicate information, trying to get your point across, and metaphors and similes are the last thing we worry about. But that's a big mistake. They do need to be in there if we want our speech to be artful and to be engaging and compelling. One example that I want to give you, at least one, has to do with repetition. Because in addition to metaphor, simile, figures of speech, the book also talks about other devices, including repetition, parallelism, antithesis, and alliteration. And all of these are simple to use, but they're very effective when they are put to use. Repetition is a great example of one that is so simple. You're just repeating a word or a phrase over the course of the speech, but it really goes a long way in creating like a cadence or a sense of rhythm in the speech that makes it engaging. One of the best examples of this I can think of is from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. Clearly, he repeats the phrase, I have a dream, several points throughout the speech, and that starts to create kind of a refrain. But also, here at the end of the speech, and I've looked it up so I can quote it for you, he uses the phrase, let freedom ring, over and over again in a way that kind of builds. And I'll quote that for you here. He says, let freedom ring, from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. Where are we at? From the mighty Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only there, let freedom ring from the Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain in Tennessee. And so on and so on. And you can see how he starts to create that cadence just through the simple act of repetition. So those are things that we can put into our speech. Parallelism is a device where you have multiple phrases or clauses in a sentence that are all structured the same way. And an example of that might be, something really simple and short, like when someone loses something, they'll use the phrase, easy come, easy go. And that's so simple. It's only 4 words, but it communicates this deep and poignant point about detachment, you know. And the person who said that, easy come, easy go, could have been really wordy and verbose if they wanted to communicate the same thing. Could have said something like, the thing came to me with no effort, and it also left without much work on my part too, which is a mouthful. But instead, they just said, easy come, easy go. And that's parallel because you got 2 phrases, easy come and easy go, and they're both structured the same way. Easy verb, and then that same word again, easy, and then a verb. So anytime you have multiple clauses in the same sentence, it helps them to be more memorable if they're all structured in the same way. Antithesis is similar. The word antithesis sounds complicated, but really it's just the juxtaposition of opposites. If you have 2 things, you put them next to each other and they are opposites, then you have utilized the literary device of antithesis. Some examples. JFK said, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. So he just took that phrase, flipped it around, turned it on its head, and repeated it again. Trying to think of some other examples of antithesis. I mean, it's in literature all the time, not necessarily even in the language use, but anytime there are opposites, like Harry Potter is the antithesis of Lord Voldemort in many ways because they're opposites. The phrase, all creatures great and small, is another example of antithesis, just because great and small are opposites. So with a lot of these devices, what I'm trying to say is it's important not to overthink them. Antithesis sounds like all intellectual and brainy and hard to wrap your head around. But really, it's just putting opposites together, because paradoxes are interesting to people. If you state things using antithesis, makes people pay a little bit more attention. Finally, alliteration is one of the funnest ones. Alliteration is when you have several words, they all start with the same consonant sound. So typical tongue twisters are examples of alliteration. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers, and so on. I always think of the film V for Vendetta when I think about alliteration, because the character V, played by Hugo Weaving, gives a speech, and almost every word in the whole speech starts with the letter V. One sentence from that is, he says, "This valorous visitation of a bygone vexation stands vivified, and is vowed to vanquish these venal and virulent vermin, vanguarding vice, and vouchsafing the violently vicious and voracious violation of volition." So clearly a very interesting phrase, although I think he may have sacrificed intelligibility with his thesaurus. Okay, to wrap things up, I've talked about the differences between speaking and writing. I've talked about some techniques to meet some goals. And those techniques are things like metaphors, similes, figures of speech, antithesis, parallelism, alliteration. The last thing I want to talk about, the last thing I want to say is, what's the point of this video lecture? What am I trying to get across? The point is, when I listen to your persuasive speech, I want to see some metaphors and some similes in your speeches. We're not just reading this chapter and learning about metaphors because it's some kind of like dry academic exercise. I hope that you will put a metaphor in there, even if it's just one metaphor, even if it's just one simile. Find a place to insert one. It's not hard. You just have to do it intentionally. In a seated class, a lot of times what I do is seat students in a circle, bring their outlines to class, have them pass their outline to the person next to them, and then it gets a little bit easier that way when you're like editing someone else's work. And I just tell them, write in a metaphor anywhere. Just pick a random spot on that page and write "like the sun" or some like zany simile, just to kind of loosen us up and get us thinking about, okay, where can I spice up my language? Where can I put in a metaphor? Where can I add some alliteration? Where can I change a word there just to make it that much more interesting? Because the first time you write your outline, okay, I'm just trying to organize my ideas, I'm just trying to get my point across, but it's important to go back and take a second look at that outline and see, now where can I spice it up to use language in a specific intentional way to meet my goals of being effective and being memorable. Okay, this is one of the longer videos I've done so far, but I hope you watched all the way to the end, and I will know whether you have or not by whether or not I hear metaphors and similes in your persuasive speech. I wish you luck, and I look forward to hearing those speeches. Thanks.